Our next talk is really exciting. It's by somebody called Brian Crowley, and it's about queering Kilmainham Gaol. So Brian, if I can hand over to you, thank you.
Hello, and greetings from Dublin. It's the Eurovision part of the of today's proceedings. So I just want to say well done to everybody for going ahead with Outing the Past. We're hoping to do Outing the Past for Dublin towards the end of March. So keep an eye out for that. I'm just really sad that I won't be able to get to go to, that I haven't been able to get to go to Leeds, because I used to live in the UK, I used to live up in Newcastle, but I never got down to Leeds, and I'm a big Alan Bennett fan. So I really like to go to Leeds and visit Armley and Tong Road and Headingley and all the other places I've read about in his writing. So enough of that. I'm going to start my talk. I have an awful lot of slides, so apologies for that. I'm just going to, oh, apologies. So I've worked out that people who are over 40 can't really work Zoom, and I think it's the way that they're going to weed us out eventually. Okay. Great. Okay, so I'm going to talk kind of in general about work that we've been doing around looking at the queer history of Kilmainham Gaol, but in particular at one story from the 19th century that I think might be of particular interest. So for those of you, some of you might have visited Dublin, might have visited Kilmainham Gaol. Kilmainham Gaol opened in 1796. It was the county jail for Dublin, so everywhere outside the city limits. But I suppose during this period when it was working as, I suppose, the county jail of Dublin in the 18th, 19th and into the early 20th century, it also became associated with the struggle for Irish independence. So it feels as if every kind of major leader of revolutionary and political movements, both, as I said, revolutionary and constitutional, at some time seems to have found themselves either a prisoner in Kilmainham or associated with it. And I suppose in some ways that's a good indication of how dysfunctional politics and Irish society was in the 19th century. However, the thing that I suppose most people associate with Kilmainham is the fact that it was the location of the executions of the leaders of the 1916 rebellion, which is the, I suppose, the rebellion which led to Irish independence. And in 1966, when President Eamon de Valera, who was the last prisoner in Kilmainham Gaol at the end of our Civil War, he was released in 1924, he came back for the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising to reopen the jail as a museum. It had been restored through voluntary labour. And he said, this is then a hallowed place. It will inspire our people to preserve the nation and encourage them to exalt it among the nations of the earth as the men of 1916 wanted it. And I suppose as somebody working in Kilmainham Gaol and the curator of collections in the museum, you're aware that you're not just working in a museum or a historic site, but it's also to a certain extent a national shrine. And there are huge amounts of sensitivities around that history. So in many ways, Kilmainham Gaol means more than just a building in terms of the history of Ireland and I suppose even how the Irish nation still works. This is an image from 2016 for the centenary commemoration of the 1916 Rising. This is President Higgins laying a wreath again in Stonebreaker's Yard, where the leaders of the 1916 Rising were executed. And in many ways, I think this is kind of like, I suppose, the holy of holies in terms of the history of Irish revolutionary and the independence struggle. So what I'm going to talk about today, however, is looking at, I suppose, its queer history, because, as I said, it was also the county jail for Dublin. And prisons are really interesting insofar as they largely deal with, I suppose, the most marginalized people within any society, whether that's the poor, people involved in sex work, obviously the history of queer people, And in many ways, everything that a society tries to hide has to be at least acknowledged within a prison, because if you wish to hide it but also punish it, you also have to acknowledge things. So it is one of the few buildings where, in some ways, the existence of men who had sex with men is at least acknowledged and is made visible. We have been kind of developing this over the last few years. You see here, we flew the pride flag outside the courthouse, which is part of the museum complex now, not without controversy. But I suppose the other reason I had been aware of it, I suppose we'd always been aware that it had a queer history, because when we opened our museum in 1996, we had this kind of interactive, which had this kind of scrolling list of crimes, one of which was buggery. And it turns out in the United States, that's not a word they use. So it became a kind of a rite of passage for every tour guide in Kilmainham Gaol that an American tourist, usually in the middle of a tour, when you said, "Have you any questions?" they would say, "Can you tell me what's buggery?" So it's always an interesting question to try to address at 11 o'clock on a summer's morning. So I started to look at the prison records, and because a lot of them have been digitized, it's a lot easier now to find references to people who were imprisoned in Kilmainham on charges of sodomy or buggery. And I suppose as some of you are probably familiar with, for much of history, that what was criminalized was the act, not the sexual identity. So you're looking for convictions under those headings, but also sometimes you would look and you would see a male name, but then you would see a female name, because again, it wasn't targeted just at men having sex with men. It was also illegal for heterosexual couples as well. But the other thing that was so interesting about it is how few convictions there were, and it was a notoriously hard crime to prove, because it's generally a private act in which both participants, if it's consensual, are equally complicit and vulnerable to prosecution. And again, the other problem was that then you would find a conviction, but then trying to find any kind of record in the newspapers at the time, it's usually underreported. This is one of the kind of richer in terms of archival evidence. This is two young men, Ernest J. Ansom from Hull, so I managed to get one Yorkshire reference into my talk, and Thomas James Lockey from Somerset, who were on board the HMS Jupiter, which visited Dublin that year, and they ended up spending 1-2 years and the other 3 years in what was then Maryborough Prison on charges of sodomy. And again, I think the fact that they're on a ship together is probably a contributing factor. But in some ways, the fact that they're both English would have been of some comfort to Irish society at the time, because generally in the press, when there is any reference to homosexual behaviour, often it's seen as kind of something that is English and certainly not Irish, not something that good, true Irish people would engage with. And if they do, it's because often, and we'll see this in the rest of my talk, that they've been led astray by outside influences. And again, I think this is something that's becomes very common within post-colonial societies, is the association sometimes of homosexuality with the colonizer. And I think it's really interesting how you see that kind of in Africa in particular. And I was very interested in the talk about Bangladesh to see if India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, if that had been the same. But certainly in Ireland, there has generally been a sense that well into the 20th century that somehow there's something inherently un-Irish about homosexuality, and often the way Irish society dealt with any form of sexual transgression was to export it abroad. So if you were gay, if you were a woman who got pregnant outside marriage, often the solution was to go to England or the United States. But anyway, back to the main focus of the talk, which is the Dublin Castle Scandals of 1884. I'm just going to give a kind of a brief outline of the context, the political context of the time, because I think it's really important in terms of understanding the significance of a lot of the elements of this story. So in the 1880s, it's a time of extreme agitation in Ireland. centering largely around the demand for land reform. At that stage, most of the land in Ireland is owned by a small number of wealthy landlords, who are generally seen as being kind of Anglo-Irish or often absentee British landowners who also have estates in Ireland. So there's a big movement for, driven not just by a sense of kind of equality, but also, of course, this is just, 30 years after the Great Irish Famine, which really kind of powers and gives, I think, a real energy and a fervour to the campaign for land reform. FYI, England, Scotland and Wales, something we still need to maybe look at. Ironically, in Ireland, through the land war, I suppose the British government did largely play a part in sorting it out in the towards the end of the 19th and early 20th century. But as part of this agitation, you had the emergence of political leaders like Charles Stewart Parnell, who was also an MP, the head of the Irish Home Rule Party. But the reaction of British administration in Ireland was to arrest, in 1881, many of the leading figures in the land movement. And Kilmainham Gaol becomes the main area, the headquarters or the main prison in which the leadership of the Land League are arrested, and becomes the focus as well of kind of international interest at the time. And then I suppose the big one then is Charles Stewart Parnell in October of 1881. And again, the world's press is very much looking at Parnell and Charles Stewart Parnell and Kilmainham Gaol. You can see him here in Vanity Fair. And he was in here with many of the leaders of his movement, including people like Jim Healy, who was an MP, and William O'Brien, who was also an MP, whom we'll be hearing more about later. Interestingly, on the very day that Parnell is released, he comes to an agreement with W.E. Gladstone, the Prime Minister at the time, that they will work together, not just for land reform for Ireland, but also for Parnell's main political goal, which is home rule, self-government for Ireland. And they come to an agreement known as the Kilmainham Treaty. But on the day that Parnell is kind of released, there's a very brutal and bloody assassination by a group known as the Invincibles, kind of an offshoot of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, another kind of secret Irish Republican revolutionary organisation. They stab the Chief Secretary, Lord Frederick Cavendish, and his Under-Secretary, T.H. Burke, to death in the Phoenix Park outside the Viceregal Lodge, the official home of the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. And this is a huge story again at the time. Then also in 1882, you have the Malmtrasna murders, which is kind of related to a dispute over land, kind of related to kind of local factional issues. Again, a very bloody killing of an entire family in a very isolated Irish-speaking area of the west of Ireland. The accused are actually held in Kilmainham for their trials. Those who are found guilty and sentenced to execution, they're executed back in Galway. But again, this kind of very bloody story is in the press. And then the Invincibles themselves are arrested and they are brought to Kilmainham Gaol, where 5 of them are hanged in the jail, and they're actually still buried in the grounds of the prison. As I said, it's a very sensitive site. This is the United Ireland showing the day that Joe Brady, the first of the Invincibles, is executed. The black flag there indicated to the thousands of people waiting outside that he'd been hanged. And in terms of how this is covered in the British press, particularly the conservative press in England at the time, this is seen as more indication that Ireland is this uncivilized place, incapable of self-government, a very brutal place, a place that needs some kind of that needs the influence of, I suppose, the rational influence of the British Empire, that left to their own devices, that these are brutal people, uncivilized people, people who have no respect for law and order, and that they need the civilizing influence of the British Empire. So this is, I suppose, the context of the story I'm going to be talking about, which centers on the newspaper of the Parnellite movement. So Charles Stewart Parnell, head of Land League, head of the Home Rule Party. He had a newspaper called the United Ireland. The editor was William O'Brien. an MP as well. And in 1883, a Home Rule MP called Tim Healy started to, I suppose, go for members of the British establishment who he felt were kind of living morally dubious lives. And he went after them initially in the House of Commons and was criticised for it, interestingly, by the Irish nationalist press. And then Healy publishes an article in the United Ireland newspaper. He said, if the House of Commons wants to make rules to stop such questions as Mr. Healy's, so these are questions about the personal morality of figures from the British administration in Ireland, it is open for it to devote its valuable time to the attempt, but it will not do so until the life and adventures of what is called the private character of various Crown employees in Ireland, from Corrie Connellan to Detective and County Inspector James Ellis French, are fully laid bare to the universe. So this is a very roundabout way of linking James Ellis French, who is the director of detectives, very much involved in the Mamtrasna murders and the Invincibles, and to link him with James Corrie Connellan, who was a former Inspector General of Prisons and used to, when I saw this, was kind of such a coincidence because he is the person who writes most about Kilmainham Gaol for much of the 19th century, because he does an annual report every second year. However, shortly after this report was published in 1868, he disappears because there are rumours about him having affairs with men, and he flees the jurisdiction, but still keeps his pension, which is a point of contention for nationalist Ireland. But by linking French with Corrie Connellan, essentially what Healy is suggesting is that Ellis French is also engaging in sexual activity with men, which was true. It had been a rumour that had been circulating for many years, but it was true. And these become known then as the Dublin Castle Scandals. And just to explain the context of Dublin Castle, it's the centre of administration, it's the headquarters of policing in Ireland. It's like Whitehall, but more, because essentially in a colonial context, all power rests with Dublin Castle, and it is a really kind of shorthand. So when I say Dublin Castle, I'm, I suppose, referring to that to that administration. Now, William O'Brien is the editor of the United Ireland, and they are issued, a writ is issued by French. He's going to sue for libel. And William O'Brien, he decides to respond by hiring a disgraced Scotland Yard detective, a guy called Michael John. He's the first guy in this caricature here. He was involved in a scandal in Scotland Yard for corruption. And Michael John comes to Dublin and he starts to investigate, not just French, but when he starts to, I suppose, find out more about French, he finds this whole network of gay men or men having sex with other men in Dublin at the time. And William O'Brien then decides to, I suppose, double down. So rather than apologizing, he actually links this man, Gustavus Cornwall, who was Irish. He was the secretary of the General Post Office. So kind of at the time, I suppose, when the post office was a big thing at the time, and O'Brien publishes something that links him with French. So he doubles down. Now, in the meantime, French has had a nervous breakdown because, as I said, these rumors were true, and he knew this. And I think he just couldn't deal with it anymore. So Cornwall then, pressure comes on him to sue for libel, which he does. And if Oscar Wilde has taught us nothing, it's don't sue for libel when it's true. So this is the General Post Office, which he would have been in charge of, and would have been the headquarters of the Post Office in Ireland at the time. And this is another big building in Dublin. This is the Four Courts, which is where the libel trial took place. And this took place in the early days of July of 1884. The libel trial goes ahead, and Michael John's investigations into this network then becomes public, and three men, a guy called George Taylor, Alfred McKernan, and Malcolm Johnston, who are part of this circle. Pressure placed on them to testify essentially against their friends, and stories start to emerge about other people in the circle, including Captain Martin Kerwin, who is an officer in the Dublin Fusiliers and a cousin of Lord Oranmore. There's one very sensational story about a trip that they paid to the Botanic Gardens in Dublin on what we would call St. Stephen's Day, what you'd call Boxing Day, in 1881. Cornwall, Kerwin, and George Taylor went to the Botanic Gardens. Cornwall apparently bribed one of the attendants to let them go into the Palm House, and well, apparently poor Cornwall had to wait outside while Taylor and Kerwin had fun inside the glass house. But they also, on another occasion, met Malcolm Johnston there. So a favoured haunt. Ultimately, all this information comes out, and Cornwall loses his libel trial. There's huge celebrations in nationalist Ireland. There are bonfires all around the country. O'Brien is issued congratulations by everyone from the Operative Bootmaker Society to the Father Matthew Teetotal Abstinence Society. This is seen as a victory for, I suppose, the integrity of Ireland. Ireland as a country that's a victim of this kind of effete but corrupt British administration, and contrast is drawn between how vigorously this British administration has pursued the Invincibles and the Mamtrasna murders and those involved in the campaign for land reform, and the degree to which they have been trying to cover up this story. It also leads to this exodus of gay men from Dublin, or men from that circle, including this guy, Richard Boyle, who was like the head of the stock exchange in Dublin, you know, proper Victorian philanthropist, married, children, everything. He flees to Spain, as do many others. There's at least two to three clergymen involved. It's very ecumenical. One's Catholic, one's Protestant, and subsequently, then you have arrests of many of those who are named in the scandal, and they end up in Kilmainham Gaol. And you see some of them here. You have Cornwall, a guy called James Ellis French, who's the head of the RSE, James Pillar, Johnston Little, Martin Kerwin, Daniel Constantine, and Robert Fowler, and a guy called Surgeon Major Alberto Fernandez. He goes to London. He's in London, at the time with his regiment, and he has to be brought back. The trial takes place in Green Street Courthouse. And over the course of the trial, you also kind of get it's kind of one of those things where, I suppose, with queer history, you have to find your joy where you can. You do get a sense of this kind of very rich life and that this circle has. So, you know, there's references to places that they meet and perhaps cruise, like St. Stephen's Green and near the urinals in College Green. Malcolm Johnston talks about having a drag ball his family were very wealthy. They were part of the Johnston, Mooney and O'Brien company, which is the big bakers in Ireland. And he had a drag ball on Clyde Road in Ballsbridge, which is a very leafy suburb. And talks about men coming and dressing as women. There's even they have all these kind of drag names or kind of female names for each other. The Marchioness of Dame Street, the Maid of Athens, who's George Taylor, Ma Fowler, who's Robert Fowler, Connie, who again is also Connie and Lady Constance Clyde, and the Marchioness of Dublin of Dame Street. They're all Malcolm Johnston. He was quite extra. I'm not surprised he had three names. The Duchess was Cornwall. So, you know, you do get this insight. Also, music seems to be a big thing for them. Cornwall is very into music. They attend the opera together. McKernan is he's a gifted singer. And for years afterwards in Dublin, referring to someone as being musical was a euphemism for being gay. You also see this kind of mix of, in terms of the class issue. So there's two guys who are arrested, Considine and Fowler, who are poor men, but who allow their tenement homes to be used as places for men to meet. One lived on Great Ship Street, which is just, you know, on the border of Dublin Castle. and Golden Lane, which is down there at the very bottom. And at this stage, these would have been kind of tenement areas. The centre of Dublin had declines dramatically in the 19th century due to the Act of Union in large part. And people are living in very kind of in terrible conditions, also often in homes built for the kind of aristocrats and merchants of the 18th century. And so it's really interesting to imagine them there together. James Pillar, who is a tea and wine merchant, he's a Quaker, and he allowed his premises in the very respectable Rathmines suburb to be used for assignations. And in some ways, Pillar is the great victim of this whole scandal, because he seems to have, I think, had very kind of sincere religious beliefs. He was a father and a grandfather, and he pleaded guilty. So he got a life sentence. He was sentenced to life. Now, he would have served maybe 10 years, but you can see here in these are his mugshots before and after, and you can kind of see on his face the effect of his imprisonment. And then I started to look in our collection to see what we had in relation to this story. And I was also wondering, how come I've never heard about this? This is such a big story. But it just seems to have been, this was not a story to pass on. But I actually just searched, just using the year 1884, and this came up. I think it was collected just because it was kind of an anti-British establishment pamphlet. It was called Hold Your Nose, a collection of sanitary songs intended for the disinfection of Dublin Castle. And what it consists of is a series of kind of doggerel poems, but each one is named after a different flower. So it's all part of this thing about hold your nose. There's a stench, there's filth coming from Dublin Castle. You can see here in this illustration from the United Ireland, you have Healy and O'Brien disinfecting Dublin Castle, and you have all the language of hygiene and health and, I suppose, science of the time. And there's an equation of homosexuality with disease, and there's references to cholera at the time. And, you know, I suppose we've all been, I suppose, looking and at It's a Sin, and I was particularly reminded of like the scene with poor Callum, where he says, you know, I'm not dirty, I'm not disgusting, but filth and dirt is referenced throughout these trials. And then this one in particular, A Moss Rose by Cabra, there's reference to contemporary figures. You've got the Earl of Spencer, who's the Lord Lieutenant, who's accused of hiding things. Bolton, who was also accused of impropriety in relation to his wife. And then you have James Ellis French. There's talk about the stench from his cell. And again, of course, you have all these flowers, because obviously that's a reference to the Botanic Gardens. But also, I think it's also a reference to the association of flowers with effeminacy and homosexuality. And obviously, that's why my background is, I think I'm going for a failed florist today. But again, Cornwall is referenced, Pillar is referenced, and so it's just really, really interesting to see how big this story was, but again, how it has faded. I'm just going to finish up really quickly. We're looking at other aspects of our collection in terms of the 1916 Rising, looking for documentation in relation to, example, Kathleen Nin and Madeline French Mullen, who were in the same-sex relationship. We have, you know, a Christmas card that they sent to one of their friends. And, you know, I suppose as a queer person, I get really excited about this because I said it's so rare from that period just to find any sign of people being overt about the fact that they're living in a unit. And it's really interesting how kind of same-sex relationships between women are able to exist kind of in plain view in a way that wouldn't be possible for two men. The other thing I've been looking at as well is kind of like the 1970s and the restoration of the jail. And the general narrative is it's actually quite a kind of a masculine one about these men who physically restored the jail together. But I've been looking at things like we have this scrapbook related to the Roger Casement controversy, which raged throughout the 20th into the 21st century about whether or not Roger Casement was gay. And what's really interesting is how these letters to the paper give you not a very encouraging, but some kind of insight into attitudes towards homosexuality in the 1970s as Kilmainham Gaol is being transformed or becomes this kind of national shrine. There's one at the very end from Pierce Beasley where he says Casement couldn't have been gay because he had a beard. So He's never been to a bear bar, clearly. But also looking at, where our collection from that period is coming from. So we have this medal, which was donated because of its association with the Fenian Raid, which was kind of the North American front of an Irish revolutionary movement in the 1860s. Turns out the man who owned the medal was later a prisoner in Kilmainham Gaol himself, but it turns out to have been donated to Kilmainham Gaol by Lydia Foy, who's the woman who led the campaign for gender recognition in Ireland. And I think it's really important that we need to find new ways of showing, I suppose, a queer presence in movements in Ireland where often the involvement of queer people would have been kind of either hidden or wasn't allowed to be made manifest at the time. So that's it from me. So I just want to say, Gustavus, thank you very much for letting me share this with you today.
Thank you so much, Brian. That was really incredibly interesting. I feel like we've got to a point now where these historical queer figures are really capturing everyone's imagination. So I'm really enjoying hearing about the different lives of people from history. We've got a few questions coming in.
Okay.
You mentioned the flag causing problems.
Yeah.
Do you find that Irish people are accepting of this previously hidden history?
On the whole, yeah. Actually, like I said, it wasn't without controversy. There was the odd phone call, the odd email. One angry man came into the reception one day. But generally, I think in Ireland, particularly in the context of the marriage referendum, which I would not advise as a way to achieve marriage equality, but having won it, it's been great because in some ways, I feel it's kind of put to bed any kind of issue that being LGBT is anything lesser in Irish society. And I also feel that in some ways, yeah, again, a very extreme way of doing it, but it has put a kind of a confidence in the community here, in the LGBT plus community in Ireland, about our identity and about being a bit more public about it. And, I've talked even as a museum professional, I said when I started my career, it was very much kind of don't ask, don't tell. And I said, like, one of the worst things I felt about when people were saying, like, why now and why are we addressing it now? And I said, the worst thing was, it wasn't that somebody told me we couldn't explore this stuff. It's that I thought I didn't even imagine that we could, I didn't even know it was a question I could ask. So as I said, there were some objections, and obviously, as I said, Kilmainham Gaol is a very sensitive site. But on the whole, people have been really positive. And I suppose the other thing that's been really useful is if anybody questioned why we have this flag there, I'm able to show them all this like really rich documented history in terms of Kilmainham Gaol's association with LGBT history. So, you can say, oh, this isn't, the thing that the right-wing press always said, oh, this is wokeism gone mad. I said, no, Kilmainham Gaol is one of the few buildings in Dublin where there's a really strong documented LGBT history.
Perfect, thank you. And it's obviously devastating that we are losing or have previously lost, and people like you we're grateful for recovering these big parts of our history that have been hidden from us. We've got a really great question just come in. When going through the records, were you able to find out who brought the crime of sodomy to the authorities' attention? What kind of connection would the people telling on others have to them?
I haven't, to be honest. In Ireland as well, it all comes back to revolutionary history, doesn't it? During the Civil War, pretty much all the court records of Ireland were burnt in the forecourts. That one of the buildings I showed during the talk. So you're reliant on press reports, and those press reports often just don't cover. So you don't know how these things came about. So, for example, the one on the HMS Jupiter, I have not been able to come across any record as to what exactly happened. And it's really interesting in the context of the Dublin Castle Scandal. Often either the judge or the journalist will say that the rest of this is not fit to be printed, and they won't report on it, which is, again, really interesting. And I think were it not for the political angle of this story, I don't think it would have been reported in the degree of detail that it was. And it's really interesting that a lot of the London press don't report it in any detail at all. But because I suppose it has this kind of political value to the Irish nationalist movement, you get this kind of moment where they are printing all the more salacious details, which is you know, it seems terrible to say it's great for us, but you know, it does give you this glimpse into this world.
Thank you so much. We're going to have to move on to the next video, but thank you for the talk, Brian. It was super informative. I'm really glad you were able to share it with us today.
No problem. No problem. I hope to get over to Leeds soon.
Yes, indeed. It is lovely here. I have to commend us for that.